All right. Good evening and welcome to this meeting of Troy City Council for Monday, December 7th, 2020. My name is William Lutz, President of Council. Tonight we'll begin the proceedings with the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance from Mr. Shelley. Please rise.
Today, December 7th, 2020, marks 79 years since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, leading to the United States entering the first truly global war, World War II. It was time of American unity, cooperation, and support of the war efforts. While there was a draft, volunteer enlistments by both men and women filled the ranks. For the first time in American history, women left the home and stepped into the jobs usually occupied by the men now serving in the military. Rosie the Riveter produced the war materiel necessary to keep the U.S. war efforts in high gear. Sacrificing for the common good, Americans willingly accepted rationing, which included such basics as automobiles, tires, gasoline, fuel oil, coal, nylon, silk, meat, dairy products, coffee, but not toilet paper. Victory gardens sprouted up throughout the country to add to the food supply, and scrap iron drives were organized to collect anything metal, from junk cars to toothpaste tubes. Even though savings were depleted by 12 years of a severe economic depression, Americans emptied their pockets and supported the war bond drives, investing millions of dollars in U.S. government bonds to help pay for the war. Over the almost 4 years of war, more than 290,000 military service members paid the ultimate sacrifice to protect America and our democratic principles. The survivors came home and helped build America into the economic juggernaut and world leader we know today. Modern historians have called the generation that accomplished all of this the greatest. Today we are facing another global war. We entered this war almost a year ago, not by our own choosing, but were drawn into the war when the enemy invaded our shores. Unlike America's efforts in World War II, this war has torn asunder the American fabric already ripped and shredded by years of divisiveness. It seems that the only Americans willing to sacrifice for the common good are the frontline healthcare workers and first responders. Little things create the greatest conflict. Lack of cooperation is justified by proclamations of individual rights and freedom of choice. The internet has made everyone an expert. The true experts with the educational credentials and the years of working to protect the American population from the ravages of other similar enemies are not to be trusted. Our elected leaders are mocked because at times they have struggled with decisions aimed at defeating an enemy they have never met before, and at the same time trying to protect their constituents from themselves. Again, the internet has made everyone an expert. By the end of this year, America will have suffered more deaths attributed to this enemy than all the American military deaths in the 4 years of World War II. Depending on how we react to the enemy this coming year, our death totals could exceed the over 600,000 deaths during the Civil War. How will future historians label our generations? Will we be praised or disparaged? Let us pray that we can join together and defeat the enemy before us. Let us pray that our healthcare workers and first-time responders continue to be willing to sacrifice and to put themselves in harm's way so that we may be protected and healed from the actions of the enemy and of ourselves. Let us pray that we can come to the realization that we have far more in common with each other than that which divides us. Let us pray that we learn again to compromise, that we learn again to work together for the common good. Let us pray that we can again place our trust in those who we elect to lead us, and that those elected will continue to work to earn our trust. Let us pray that we can learn again to place our country before ourselves. Let us pray that we can mend our American fabric and can be proud once again to call ourselves Americans. Let us now stand and pledge allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Sneed. Here. Mr. Phillips.
Here.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Here.
Mr. Siebert.
Present.
Mr. Allen.
Here.
Mr. Twist.
Here.
Mr. Swazer.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Here.
Mr. Rozell.
Here.
All members are present.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. At this time, we move into a public hearing on Ordinance 052-2020. If you wish to speak for or against the item, please come forward, give your name and address, and take as much time as you consume. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 052-2020, an ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08250517 in the city of Troy from the zoning classification of M2 to B3 Central Business District.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Again, if anyone wishes to come up to speak for or against the ordinance, you're invited to do so. Seeing no one, we will declare the public hearing closed. Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of the minutes of the November 16th, 2020 meeting of council?
November 16, 2020. Public hearings were held on 3 rezoning ordinances, 049, 050, and 051, 2020. Committee reports. Community Partnership Committee recommended that legislation be prepared waiving a tap-in fee paid by Troy Community Works for the building at 1-3 East Main Street. Personnel Committee recommended legislation be prepared to adjust the hourly rate for seasonal and part-time employees. Recreation and Parks Committee recommended that legislation be prepared to declare as surplus a parcel to the rear of 2854 Englewood Drive. Committee recommended that no legislative action be taken in response to the Board of Park Commissioners' recommendation for a smoking ban at public parks. Safety and Health Committee recommended that legislation be prepared authorizing an agreement and funding to Miami County Public Health for 2021, the amount of $383,184.97. Committee recommended that legislation be prepared encouraging the governor to extend the deadline for operating public meetings electronically. Resolution number R65-2020, agreement with public health and funding for 2021, was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R66-2020, regarding extending the deadline for operating public meetings electronically, was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R67-2020, waiving tap-in fee, was given first reading and was adopted. Ordinance number 049-2020, a rezoning of 121 West Franklin Street, was given public hearing and second reading. Ordinance 050-2020 was a rezoning for 25 South Plum Street, was given second reading and public hearing. Ordinance number 051-2020, a rezoning for 21 South Plum Street, was given public hearing and second reading. Ordinance number 052-2020, rezoning 212 South Mulberry, was given first reading. Ordinance number 053-2020, amending salary ordinance for part-time workers, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 054-2020, accepting the application for an annexation of 2.446 acres of city property, was given first reading and was adopted. Following various comments, council adjourned at 7:37 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to act on the item?
Move to approve. Second.
It's been moved to adopt the minutes by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, please call roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed? Yes. Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We'll begin with our committee reports for this evening, and we have quite a few of them. We'll begin with the Buildings and Utilities Committee with Mr. Allen.
Thank you. Committee members Terwilliger and Allen met on November 23rd to consider the request to recommending bidding for the new fire station #1 construction project The new station will be constructed on the southeast corner of Canal and Walnut Streets, and authorization includes all elements of the project, including furnishings and construction administration. The project is estimated to be finished in early 2022. It's a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the new Fire Station 1 construction project at a cost not to exceed $6.1 million. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Twilliger, Mr. Twist, and myself, Zachary Allen, as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Do any council members have comments or questions on the report? Seeing none, we will move on to the Community and Economic Development Committee and Mrs. Sneed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Committee members Rozelle and Snee met on November 23rd to review the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission that 3 parcels located at 121 West Franklin Street, 25 South Plum Street, and 21 South Plum Street be rezoned from B3 to OC1. This committee supports the recommendations of the Troy Planning Commission and recommends that ordinance numbers 049-2020, which is 121 West Franklin Street, 050-2020, which is 25 South Plum Street, and 051-2020, which is 21 South Plum Street, rezoning the 3 parcels from B3 Central Business District to OR1 Office Residence District be approved based on the findings of the Planning Commission. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozelle, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Sneed. Do any council members have any comments or questions on the report? Moving on to the Community Partnerships Committee, Mr. Rozelle, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Lutz. This committee met on November 23rd to consider authorizing a loan to the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio, CIC, which the CIC would then loan to the Troy Development Council, TDC. The TDC then purchased an approximate 73.23 acre site on Experiment Farm Road and sell the acreage for economic development purposes. The process is similar to when the CIC became the prime lender associated with the redevelopment of the Shorewood Shopping Center. It is recommendation of this committee that the legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an agreement and to execute necessary documents with the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio to loan an amount not to exceed $800,000 to the CIC, with the understanding that the CIC will loan said funds to Troy Development Council for the purchase of real property for an economic development project, and as the land is sold and the CIC repaid, those funds would accrue to the city to pay off the loan. Noting that the loan may need to be processed soon, this committee supports emergency legislation. This is respectfully submitted by Zachary Allen, John Schweizer, and myself, William Rozelle, as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rozelle. Do any council members have comments or questions on the report?
Yes, I got one question.
Yes, sir.
Part of this land is the boundary goes to the interstate. Okay.
Yes, it does.
And then in committee meeting, there's another portion of this that won't be able to be developed as well. Or were you talking about the same thing in the committee?
I think we're basically talking about the same thing. As you get towards the to the interstate, you have topography issues, but we will also be looking at stormwater retention and detention there.
Okay.
I have a comment, Mr. President. I just spoke with the auditor to confirm, but Sherwood's been paid off in full, right?
Yes,
So,
yes.
so this is just sort of redoing with those funds what we did in the past.
Redirecting funds we'd already obligated at one point, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from council members? Moving on, we have 2 reports from the Finance Committee and Mr. Schweizer.
Yes, sir. Committee members Phillips and Schweizer met on November 23rd to consider legislation urging the Ohio General Assembly to oppose Senate Bill 352, and House Bill 754 due to the consequence that will result related to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the municipal income tax structure throughout Ohio. Both bills contain provisions that would repeal sections 29 of House Bill 197 that allows municipal corporations to continue withholding income tax at a taxpayer's place of work, even if a taxpayer is currently working from home in another local jurisdiction until 30 days after the end of Governor DeWine's declaration of emergency due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Repealing Section 29 of House Bill 197 would have a severe negative impact on municipalities and their ability to fund basic services that benefit their citizens. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared urging the Ohio General Assembly to oppose Senate Bill 352 and House Bill 754 due to the consequence that will result related to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the municipal income tax structure throughout Ohio, so that the resolution can be submitted to the General Assembly without delay. This committee supports emergency legislation, and this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schweizer. Do council members have any comments or questions on the report? Mr. Schweizer, you can go ahead with the second report.
The second one is regarding the annual budget. On November 30th, Finance Committee members Sievert and Schweizer and other members of council met for the review of the 2021 budget. This budget reflects the mayor's and the council's #1 priority of economic development. We note that a budget must be a working document, and we anticipate some reappropriations during the year. The work and cooperation of the mayor, city administration, and department heads is appreciated in developing the budget document. It is the recommendation of this committee that 2021 budget of the city of Troy be approved by the preparation and adoption of the appropriation ordinance. The appropriation includes funding for agencies, and we recommend that legislation be prepared authorizing the following for 2021 with the funding remitted quarterly. Troy Development Council, $125,000. Troy Main Street, $55,000. Troy Rec Department or Troy Rec Association, Inc., $29,000. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Schweizer. Do council members have any comments or questions on the report? Seeing none, we will move to the Streets and Sidewalks Committee and 3 reports this evening from Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. President. On November 23rd, this committee met to consider the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission regarding a petition for an alley vacation submitted by the First United Methodist Church. Also discussed was the future vacation of a related unneeded access easement that would then permit the church to replat the properties into a single lot. As noted in the detailed report, committee member Schilling will be abstaining from the committee recommendation and any recommended legislation. It is the recommendation of this committee supporting the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission and recommends that legislation be prepared approving the vacation of a 12-foot by 66-foot length alley along the east side of in-lots 376 and 375 and the west side of in-lots 369 and 370 between South Plum and South Cherry Streets, south of Franklin Street. At the time the access easement vacation can be presented, we recommend approval of the unneeded access easement of record running west from Cherry Street to the alley to be vacated. And this is respectfully submitted by Mrs. Snee and myself as chairman and Mr. Schilling as a recusal.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Any comments or questions on this report? Mr. Phillips, go ahead.
Continuing, the committee also met on November 23rd to consider recommending additional professional design services for the West Main Street Corridor Improvement Project Phases 1 and 2. The additional services are for the design of a duct bank for the utility companies to bury some utilities in the project area that are currently located above ground. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an additional professional services agreement with Strand Associates, Inc. at a cost not to exceed $125,000 for the design of a duct bank for the West Main Street Improvement Project Phases 1 and 2. This project has been successful in obtaining over $6 million in grant funding for construction and construction engineering services. In order to not delay the additional design, and to stay on schedule for the design completion, project bidding, and grant funding schedule. The committee supports emergency legislation, and this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this item? Mr. Phillips, go ahead with your last report this evening.
Thank you, sir. Additionally, on November 23rd, the committee met to consider the State Route 41, which is West Main Street Interconnect Phase 2 project. The project has been approved for 80% funding from an ODOT Surface Transportation Program grant. The project consists of a full replacement of the signals at West Main Street and Maryville Drive. It is the recommendation of this committee that the legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract with State Route 41 Interconnect Phase 2 project at a cost not to exceed $361,107. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Are there any comments or questions on the report? I believe we have an oral report for liquor application from the Law and Ordinance Committee of Mr. Siebert.
That is correct. The Ohio Division of Liquor Control has transmitted the notice of the application to transfer liquor permits from safekeeping held by Leo's La Piazza Inc. to North Market Street as follows. The applicant will be A&R Troy LLC, Agave and Rye, 2 North Market Street. Permits under the application are defined as follows. D1, beer only for on-premises consumption or in original sealed containers for carryout only until 1 a.m. D2, wine and mixed beverages for on-premises consumption or in original sealed containers for carryout only until 1 a.m. D3, spirituous liquor for on-premises consumption only until 1 a.m. D6, sale of intoxicating liquor on Sunday between the hours of 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. and midnight. The objection filing date is December 24th, 2020. The police department has not recommended an objection or hearing request be filed.
Thank you, Mr. Siebert. Any comments or questions from council members on the report? Seeing none, we will now open the meeting to citizen comments for those items strictly on the agenda. We have 8 ordinances and 8 resolutions for discussion. If you wish to come forward, please come up, give your name and address. You have 2 minutes to speak to any item on the agenda. Seeing none, we'll move on to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, please read resolution R68.
Resolution number R68, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with Strand Associates, Inc. of Cincinnati, Ohio, to provide additional services for the design of phases 1 and 2 of the West Main Street Corridor Improvement Project and declaring an emergency. The cost of the additional design is not to exceed $125,000. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to act?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee. Yes. Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The 3 reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Twist. Any further comments or questions from council members? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee. Yes. Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R69, 2020?
Resolution number R69, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the State Route 41 West Main Street Traffic Signal Interconnect Project Phase 2. This would be at a cost not to exceed $361,107. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to act on the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Move to adopt. Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Sievert, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R70, 2020?
Resolution number R70, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the new Fire Station Number 1 construction project. This will be at a cost not to exceed $6,100,000. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House Counsel wish to move on the item?
Move to suspend. Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Terwilliger and seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Three reading rule has been suspended. House Counsel wish to act?
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R71, 2020?
Resolution number R71, 2020. Resolution strongly opposing Senate Bill 352 and House Bill 754, legislation proposing the repeal of Section 29 of 197, which will result in a myriad of unintended consequences through Ohio's entire municipal income tax system, cause a substantial loss of revenue that will impede the ability of municipalities to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of municipal residents and businesses, and thereby jeopardize the future economic growth of the state of Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This would be the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House Counsel wish
Move
to
to
act on the item?
suspend. Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell and seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes. The three reading rule has been suspended. House Counsel wish to act?
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read resolution R72, 2020?
Resolution number R72, 2020. Resolution approving a loan to the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio for the purchase of approximately 73.23 acres at 1401 Experiment Farm Road. Authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an agreement with the Community Improvement Corporation of Troy, Ohio related to the development of said land for economic development purposes and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading. The loan would be in the amount of $800,000.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House Counsel wish to act?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell and seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
yes,
Three reading rule has been suspended. How does council wish to act?
Move to adopt.
Second. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Schilling. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R73, 2020?
Resolution number R73, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Board of Recreation of the City of Troy, Ohio to enter into a contract with the Troy Recreation Association, Inc. for recreation services. This is the contract for year 2021 with a funding contribution of $29,000. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to act?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Terwilliger and seconded by Mr. Sievert. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
Affirmative.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Sievert. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R74, 2020?
Resolution number R74, 2020, resolution approving funding to Troy Main Street, Inc. This would be for the calendar year of 2021, financial contribution of $55,000. First reading.
How does council wish to act?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. And will you please read the last resolution of the evening? Resolution R75, 2020.
Resolution number R75, 2020, resolution approving funding to the Troy Development Council for economic development for the city of Troy. This would be for the calendar year 2021, funding contribution of $125,000 total. This is the first reading.
Move for suspension.
second,
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to ordinances. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 049, 2020?
Ordinance number 049, 2020, a An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08001930 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of B3 Central Business District to OR1 Office Residence District. This is located at 121 West Franklin Street, has been recommended by the Troy Planning Commission, and this is the third reading.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mrs. Snead. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 050-2020?
Ordinance number 050-2020. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08001937 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of B3 Central Business District to OR1 Office Residence District. This is located 25 South Plum Street, has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. This is the third reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to act?
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mrs. Snead, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr.
Got a
Schilling,
mouthful of water. Sorry.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please kindly read ordinance 051-2020?
Ordinance number 051-2020.
Oh, I'm sorry, 052-2020.
Uh,
Oh, we just did, we're on 51?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. 051.
Ordinance number 051-2020. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08001940 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of B3 Central Business District to OR1 Office Residence District. This is located at 21 South Plum Street. Has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. This is the third reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to act?
Move to
Move to
adopt.
adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, now I will kindly ask you to read ordinance 052-2020.
Ordinance number 052-2020. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08250-517 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of M2 Light Industrial District to the zoning classification of B3 Central Business District. This received a public hearing this evening. It's been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. This is the second reading, and the committee of council will be considering this at the next committee meeting.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Since this still needs to go through the committee process, this will stand as the second reading and will be held over for a third reading at our next meeting. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 055-2020?
Ordinance number 055-2020. Ordinance amending ordinance number 042-2019, appropriating funds necessary for the various departments and offices of the city of Troy, Ohio for the year 2020. This is the reappropriation of certain funds as recommended by the city auditor. This is the first reading.
How does council wish to act?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions from council members? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 056, 2020?
Ordinance number 056, 2020. Ordinance appropriating funds necessary for the various departments and offices of the city of Troy, Ohio for the year 2021. This is the approval of the budget. This is the first reading.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mrs. Snead. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
No.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mrs. Snead. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 057, 2020?
Ordinance number 057, 2020, an ordinance vacating a portion of an unimproved 12-foot alley located between South Plum Street and South Cherry Street, south of West Franklin Street in the city of Troy, Ohio. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. First reading.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It has been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling,
I'm going to recuse myself on this one. Thank you.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Move for adoption.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Again, because I'm a member of the First United Methodist Church and also a member of the trustee committee of First United Methodist Church, and because of my membership in the church, I directly benefit from this ordinance. If it is passed by council, I recuse myself from the vote.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. And Mrs. Knight, will you kindly read the last piece of legislation this evening, ordinance 058, 2020?
Ordinance number 058, 2020. Ordinance to accept the application for the annexation of certain territory containing 83.356 acres more or less in Staunton Township to the city of Troy, Ohio. This was known as Liberty Lot Sales Annexation. It had initially been approved by council, has been approved by the county and returned back to the city for final approval. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council
Move to
wish that?
suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Seaver,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We move on to communications and announcements, and Mrs. Knight, are there any communications?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to comments from officials. Mayor Oda, do you have anything that you'd like to speak on this evening?
Do not.
Thank you, Mayor. Moving on, Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterington, do you have anything to add this evening?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to remind everybody that we are closed December 24th and 25th, as well as January 1st. The 25th and the 1st are the 2 days out of the year that we do delay trash and recycling.
Thank you, Mr. Titterington. Director of Law, Mr. Kerber, do you have anything to add this evening?
I have nothing to add this evening. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Kerber. City Auditor, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, sir. Do any council members have anything that they would like to add for the good of the order this evening? Do any of our city staff members, which there are heavens plenty this evening, have anything that they'd like to add this evening? Do any residents have anything that they would like to add this evening? Please come forward, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume.
Andrea Keller, 331 South Market. I am the Executive Director of Troy Main Street, and I would just like to say a sincere thank you to council for your continued support. We really appreciate it, and it is imperative for what we do that we have a good relationship with the city, and we're blessed to have that. So thank you for your support.
Thank you, Andrea, and all the good work that your group does. Anyone else have anything to add for this evening's proceedings? Seeing none, we declare this meeting adjourned. We'll see you all back here on December 21st.